Hello, everybody. Today, I'm going to give a presentation about the mysterious history of Avalon. Recently, we had our Zoom session about the days of Apple. And of course, Avalon means place of apples, but it has quite an intriguing history. And I'm going to talk us through it, and there's many intrigues to look at. So to do so, as usual, I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint presentation that I've spent the last couple of days putting together. Okay, so this is a lovely carving of Geoffrey of Monmouth. It's that Tinton railway station, which doesn't exist anymore as a railway station. It's just a playground, park, garden. But there's this lovely carving of Geoffrey of Monmouth. So Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing around about 1130 AD up to 1150 AD. And his most famous book is called The History of the Kings of Britain. However, it's not a history book, it's a work of fiction. So it's closer to the old French word histoire, which just means story. So rather than saying history of the Kings of Britain, it's better to think of it as Geoffrey's story about the kings of Britain. It's not history as we know it in the modern day. For instance, he has dialogue between Iron Age characters, and he turns gods and goddesses into human beings. But it's a fascinating read nonetheless. And probably the most important element of the history of the kings of Britain is that it's the first kind of life story of King Arthur. And up until Geoffrey of Monmouth, there's just a few scant references to Arthur in writings of Nennius and in the Welsh annals. But Geoffrey of Monmouth is the first writer to tell us Arthur's story from birth till death. And it's the first mention of Guinevere. It's the first mention of his sword Excalibur. It's the first mention of Merlin. Now, none of these things appear until Geoffrey's story about the kings of Britain. Now, his story then is the very first evidence of the name Avalon. And he only mentions it twice in passing, really. He doesn't say a great deal about it. Mainly at the end of Arthur's story, Geoffrey says that Arthur was taken to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his mortal wounds. And that's it. And prior to that, earlier on in the story, Geoffrey of Monmouth also says that King Arthur's sword, Caliburn, now better known as Excalibur, that it was forged in the Isle of Avalon. And that's it. So all you get from Geoffrey of Monmouth's first story is that King Arthur's sword was made in the Isle of Avalon, and that at the end of his life, Arthur was sent to Avalon, you know. Now, first things to get clear in your head then is that the word Avalon, as we know it today, is the modern spelling. That's not how it was spelt originally. So when it was first written down, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote in Latin, and he spelt it Insula Avallonis. So as the Insula is an island or sometimes it can mean a sacred enclosure. So it's not necessarily an island, but a sacred enclosure, Avallonis. So people were tantalized by that. You know, he wrote this about 1136 AD, and it would be another 15 years before he wrote more and expanded upon what was Avalon. People were fascinated. What is Avalon? We've never heard of this before. And that's quite important. So 15 years afterwards, Geoffrey wrote another story, and in Latin, it's called the Vitae Merlini. In English, that just means the life of Merlin. And really, it's not even the life of Merlin. For most of Merlin's story, you need Geoffrey's previous book, The History of the Kings of Britain. But the life of Merlin really deals with Merlin at the end of his very long life, long after Arthur has died. There's a civil war between Britons. Rather than defending Britain against the Saxons or the Irish or the Picts, the Britons fight amongst themselves in a pointless civil war. And seeing all the bloodshed of Britons killing Britons and not defending their land, Merlin goes mad. And this battle happens in the north of Britain, not far from Hadrian's Wall. And Merlin just runs off as an old man, as a mad, almost like a extreme post-traumatic stress disorder. And he makes his way north to the Caledonian forest. And he lives as a wild man in the forest. It's probably north of the River Clyde, north of Dumbarton Rock, because the story unfolds that Merlin's sister lives at Dumbarton Rock, and she builds Merlin an astronomical house for observing the stars and predicting the fortunes of the land, and that all happens in the Caledonian forest. But Merlin is chaotic in his brain. You know, sometimes he's peaceful, other times he's raging mad. And in a moment of clear thinking, he tells his sister that he would like Taliesin, the chief of bards, to come and see him. So Taliesin receives the message, and Taliesin goes to the Caledonian forest to find Merlin and talk to him. And they have a long conversation. It's really worth getting hold of the book, The Life of Merlin by Geoffrey of Monmouth, because the conversation between Taliesin and Merlin is priceless. It's a brilliant look at esoteric cosmology of the 12th century. Whatever Geoffrey of Monmouth had in his mind, he put into the mouths of Taliesin and Merlin. But very interesting. Yeah, too much to go into. But whilst they're conversing, coming back to what we're talking about, Merlin seems to recall Arthur. And he says to Taliesin, what happened to Arthur? And so then Taliesin explains what happened to Arthur. And that goes into more detail then about the Isle of Avalon, or Insula Avallonis, although in the life of Merlin, Geoffrey changes the name to the Fortunate Isle and the Isle of Apples. And before Taliesin explains what happened to Arthur, he starts talking about otherworld paradise realms, and one of them he mentions is the island of the Hesperides, which has the golden apples of Hesperides. It's one of the labors of Hercules. So they're setting up this idea of otherworldly realms. And then Taliesin explains how they took Arthur by ship to the Isle of Avalon, and that it's a paradise realm, and that when they were at Avalon, they were greeted by the Lady Morgan, the head of 9 sisters. So this is where the tradition comes from, of there being 9 Morgans on the Isle of Avalon. It's from the Life of Merlin by Geoffrey of Monmouth. And Taliesin explains how they leave Arthur with Morgan and her sisters, and that she will tend to him, and she believes she can, over a long time, heal him of his wounds. So the implication is that Arthur has been taken to a paradise otherworld beyond this world, and is being nursed, and will one day return, that she can heal him. You know, this story of 9 sisters on an island in the west is the direction of the other world, the setting sun, the golden realm, comes from Breton history. There was on the west coast of Brittany, still there, an island called Ile-de-Son. And at Ile-de-Son, as early as the 2nd century AD, Roman writers described 9 druidesses that lived on the Isle of Son, you know, and that they were seers and oracles and healers, so on. So coming back to Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing his fictional histories, you know, so the history of the kings of Britain is not history, it's a story. And the Life of Merlin is also a story. But where is Geoffrey getting his ideas from? They are ideas from the Celtic lands, their ancestral stories that he's weaving together. So it's from Ile-de-Son that the idea of 9 sisters on a sacred island comes from. And evidence suggests that Geoffrey of Monmouth, whilst he's of Monmouth, he's in the mid-1100s, and Monmouth, after the Norman invasion, you know, Battle of Hastings, 1066 and all of that, the Welsh marches, the borderlands, belonged to Norman and Breton nobility. And the evidence suggests that Geoffrey of Monmouth is part of the aristocratic Breton family that settled in Monmouth in Wales after 1066. So he seems to have family stories or cultural stories from Brittany and elsewhere in France, because his culture is Norman French. The reason I'm emphasizing that is because he shows quite a lot of ignorance about the Welsh language. So scholars tend to think that he's a Breton rather than a native Welsh speaker. Whatever the case may be, it's a theoretical thing. But anyway, there is a historical origin of 9 sisters on an island in the west. So that was 1150, and 40 years later, 1191, Geoffrey of Monmouth has died. He died around 1181. So about 10 years after he died, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to find King Arthur's grave. And they dug deep, they dug about, I think it's like 16 foot deep or something, between two obelisks. The old history book, the Antiquities of Glastonbury, describes them as pyramids, but really they would have been like Saxon cross shafts. But they're fascinating things. So more like obelisks than triangular pyramids, but one of them was 26 foot high, the other was 18 foot high. And after the abbey had a seriously bad fire, there was a lot of rebuilding, and the monks took the opportunity to dig between these two pyramids. That's their story, and I'll question it later on because the timing is very suspicious. But anyway, in 1191, they dug between these two obelisks, pyramids, and they discovered a coffin upon which was a lead cross. And written in jumbled Latin on this lead cross, it said, and I'm not a Latin speaker, so something like, Hic jacet sepultus incletus rex artorius in Insula Avallonnia. So again, not Avalon. Avalon is the modern spelling. So Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in Latin, had it Avallonis, and the monks' lead cross from Glastonbury Abbey had it as Avallonia. Now, we'll come back to that shortly. Just to get some clarity, I don't want to upset any of my esoteric friends in Glastonbury, and I am a believer in the Celtic otherworld. So whilst some of this presentation might turn Avalon on its head a little bit, but actually truth is stranger than fiction and is quite wonderful. Glastonbury already was a sacred isle, and the evidence suggests that it was an Isle of the Dead and a crucial entry point into what the Brythonic Celts called Annwn. Annwn means the other world, or more literally, the inner world, the spirit world, the inner world. So thinking of Glastonbury as an otherworldly place, a paradise realm that wounded kings go to be healed. The Celts of Britain already had that, but they called it Annwn, A-N-N-W-N. They didn't call it Avalon. Avalon is a Norman French word. It's not a Brythonic Celtic word of Wales. So I was saying about Geoffrey of Monmouth possibly not being a Welsh speaker. But anyway, I digress. The ancient name of Glastonbury is not Avallonia. The ancient name of Glastonbury is Unis Witrin, which means the Isle of Glass, or the Glass Isle. What that name means, no one knows really, lots of ideas. But the veil is thin, the spirit world is close, and it was sacred ground, to the Brythonic Iron Age Celts before the Romans arrived. So just to recap very quickly, Avalon, or Insula Avallonis, is first mentioned in 1136 in the fictional History of the Kings of Britain. Then in 1150, it's described in more detail in the Life of Merlin. Taliesin explains that Morgan, the Lady Morgan, the head of 9 sisters, received Arthur to heal his wounds. And then just 40 years later, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to find King Arthur's grave. spelling it slightly different as Insula Avallonnais. So here's the current marking of King Arthur's grave in Glastonbury Abbey as it appears in the present day. So here's a thing then. At the end of the 1100s, at the end of the 12th century, Catholic Europe was becoming quite fanatical. You know, the Crusades had begun, and, you know, even being slightly heretical, like the Cathars in the south of France, who are nominally Christian, but they just see things very differently to the Vatican, were all burnt, put to death, you know. So unless you actually saw things straight down the line as rigid dogma of the Catholic Church, you were taking a risk, you know. And the Arthurian stories, romances, and Celtic traditions that spoke of the fairy and the other world had to be hidden in stories, because you couldn't go around believing in stuff like that. So with Arthur then, Geoffrey of Monmouth had made him very popular. And suddenly, though, there was this king, this mythical king, who had kind of avoided death by going to a beautiful, mysterious, otherworldly paradise, Avalon, or Insula Avallonis, to the Lady Morgan. And more than that, the legends were, the Welsh would say, not wise a thought, a grave for Arthur. You know, simplistically, he could return. He might come back again, you know. So the heresy is this, that according to Catholic dogma, there was only one being who had died, was in paradise, and would return as a second coming, and that was Jesus. Yet these Celts, these Britons, are believing that this old king of theirs is in a paradise realm and that he will return again one day. That's a seriously heretical idea. You know, the only way of having everlasting life for Catholics is the second coming, when everybody rises from the graves to live happily ever after. You know, here's this Celtic tradition that has to be silenced, you know. So there's quite a few intrigues behind King Arthur's grave. This is just one of them. Suddenly, by saying, here's King Arthur's grave, two things have happened. Arthur is not coming back, because here's his skeleton. We've got his bones. We know where he's buried. Secondly, the doorway to the Celtic fairy world or other world or paradise, Avallonis, was shut down. That it was materialized into Somerset, that it was this Somerset market town is Avalon, not some mythical other realm. There are more intrigues behind the grave of King Arthur, which I might touch on further on. About 60 years after the monks claimed to find King Arthur's grave, another legend was heaped upon Glastonbury. Round about 1250 AD, by an unknown hand, an anonymous scribe, the legend of Joseph of Arimathea visiting Glastonbury and settling in Glastonbury was added to the Antiquities of Glastonbury. The Antiquities were written around 1135 by William of Malmesbury, and they were a bit like Wikipedia, that different generations could add bits to it. So it's not, it's a changeable history. So it's quite common that things would get added, but they don't know who added this legend, and it was added because of the popularity of Joseph of Arimathea, who'd been made famous around 1200 AD by a writer called Robert de Boron, who described Joseph of Arimathea and his descendants traveling to the west with the Holy Grail, So suddenly Glastonbury was not just Avalon and the grave of King Arthur, but it was also where Joseph of Arimathea settled, according to an unknown writer. So what do we make of the word Avallonis or Avallonnia? Just like the origin of the 9 maidens can be traced to the island of Ile-de-Saône in the 2nd century AD, could there be a real world origin that inspired Geoffrey of Monmouth's fictional stories? Why didn't he just say Annwn, or the land of eternal youth, or Ternano, or wherever? He chose this place name Avallonis. Now, Glastonbury, in more recent times, he passed away just a few years ago, but there was a well-established historian living in Glastonbury who'd been writing about Glastonbury legends since, I think, at least the early 1960s. A man called Geoffrey Ash lived on the slopes of Glastonbury Tor. And he actually said in 1985 where the original Avalon was, but people haven't picked up on it or they've ignored it. So in 1985, in his book, The Discovery of King Arthur, Geoffrey Ash says of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Geoffrey's Latin, Insula Avallonis, has been influenced by the spelling of a real place called Avalon, which is a Gaulish name with the same meaning. And the real Avalon is in Burgundy. Now that's from Geoffrey Ash's Discovery of King Arthur in 1985. So Avalon in Burgundy, what is there to see there? This is a close-up of a book cover, but you can see Glastonbury on one side of the English Channel and Avalon on the other side of the English Channel. And this book came out in 2009, building upon the suggestions made by Geoffrey Ash, the Glastonbury historian. This book, King Arthur's French Odyssey, Avalon in Burgundy, by Marilyn Floyd, and the foreword for it, giving his blessing, was written by Geoffrey Ash, the Glastonbury historian. So the rest of this presentation is about Avalon in Burgundy and the amazing discoveries there, and things that are still waiting to just be explored. It's quite exciting, really. But before we get to it, there's 2 towns. There is the town of Avalon, which we'll look at first. And then about 8 miles from Avalon, there's the very important town of Vasily. Vasily is kind of the spiritual heart of France, very important area. But the place between them, between the 8 miles between them, is a wooded area, woodland area, known as the Avallonnais. Let's put your mind back to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Avallonis. Not Avalon, it's a modern spelling, but Insula Avallonis. And here is the Avallonnais. know, Norman French culture. Why would Geoffrey of Monmouth think of sending Arthur there to be healed? We'll come to that. So here's a more modern map. I was very fortunate enough to go there myself in 2013. So 4 years after Marilyn Floyd's book came out. I went there with a couple of friends of mine, Mandy and Kevin, and we were able to look around for a few days. So some of the photos I'm about to show you now, I took myself back in 2013, which is 10 years ago. Roughly the triangular area between Avalon and Vasily is a forest. It's a national park, and it's called the Morvan National Park. And this is old Celtic land. The tribe that lived here before the Romans conquered them were called the Aedui, A-E-D-U-I, Aedui. And they were a very important Celtic tribe. But Avalon itself then, looking at the town, before we do, just to go over some words. So the old Roman name of the town of Avalon is Aballo. For the Celts, the letter B and the letter V for victory, B and V are interchangeable depending on regional dialects. It can be B or a V. The Gallic name of the town appears to have been Aballu, which is believed to mean the place of apple trees, or even the place of the apple tree goddess. And that's really very interesting. Come back to that. But simplistically, Irish, Old Irish for apple is Abel, Welsh, Athol, Breton, Abel, sort of thing. So Avalon, the place of the apple trees, or even place of the apple tree goddess. Just a couple of weeks ago, you can find it on the YouTube channel. I made a video about the second Acma. You can look it up. This is the picture for the video. And in this video, I go into some explanation of the Summer Queen corresponding with the days of apple. That's really quite important if Avalon is the place of the goddess of the apple trees, or the apple tree goddess. Fascinating thing. So she's going to be a Summer Queen, sovereignty goddess of this area of Celtic France. But if you want to know more about the Summer Queen and her importance, have a look at this video. You'll find it in the YouTube channel. So back to Avalon in France. This is an illustration of how it looked in the 12th century, the time when Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing his stories. It's a roughly triangular shaped town on top of a hill with towers and walls all around it. You know, perfect kind of medieval Arthurian romance type setup, if you like. And this is how it looked in the 16th century. You know, fascinating town of, ramparts all around it and turrets. And this is how it looks today, or this is how it looked in 2013, 10 years ago, when I took these photographs. It's my friend Kevin on the right walking towards the clock tower. So I'm just going to flick through a few pictures so you get a feel for it. And it is still an old town, lovely old buildings, you know, and very narrow cobbled streets as well. So there are, you know, the 21st century is there around the bottom, industrial units and stuff. But the town on top of the hill itself is still full of old world charm. The main church there is the Church of Saint Lazarus, and above the main entry, here's a close-up. You can't really make it out on this image, but arching over the entrance are the signs of the zodiac, interspersed with other agricultural details. And this is going to be a recurring theme, but this kind of zodiacal influence, suggestive of Star Lord teachings that were being held on to, as at least in the 12th century, possibly onwards, is there in the old religious buildings and in the landscape. I'm going to say too much just yet. Walking around the ramparts of Avalon with Kevin and Mandy, we saw here the signs of the zodiac embedded into the rampart walls. Can't really make it out very well. Here's a close-up of Scorpio. You know, but all 12 signs were there, just as a, not even part of a church or anything. It's just part of the ramparts around Avalon. Interesting to have the scorpion, because that will be significant further on. Now, from Avalon, then see the sign, this is in the centre of town, pointing to the museum of the Avallonnais near the tourist office. We travel now from Avalon to Vasily through the Avallonnais, Insula Avallonis. So it's a beautiful wooded area, the national park of Morvan, forests and streams, and just below Avalon is the river Kusan flowing through the trees. It's beautiful. Wanted to stay there much longer than we had time to. An enchanted forest, most definitely, but we were on a bit of a whistle-stop tour, frustratingly. I want to go back and just spend a week in Avalon itself. But yes, beautiful, 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 beautiful. And as you're passing through the Avallonnais, you eventually see Vasily. And this photograph isn't too good because it was raining and I took the photograph through the car windscreen. So there's raindrops on the windscreen. But there's Vasily as you approach. It is another Glastonbury tor, a prominent hill with a tower on top. Unlike Glastonbury, though, the tower on top of Vasily is not a ruin. It's a functioning abbey or basilica. So this is the top of Vasily. This is the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene. Vasily claimed to have the relics of Mary Magdalene, and it became the cult centre for Magdalene worship and pilgrimages in France. It's a massive deal there, you know, and it can be connected esoterically to the Black Madonnas and the Cathars and all of those ideas, and maybe even ancient Egyptian things to do with Isis and Marseille and so on. But before we enter into the Basilica here, I want to take you back to Britain, to Hadrian's Wall, because I want to explain some mystery tradition, star lore, that is going to be very significant to the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene. So, from Hadrian's Wall of the 4th century, there's this icon of the Persian mystery traditions favoured by the Roman army of Mithras. It's a Mithraic icon. it's called, if you want to Google it, it's called the Mithraic Rock Birth from Hadrian's Wall. And I believe it's in the Museum of Newcastle. So here's some important things. It's more about the signs of the zodiac that go around Mithras. Mithras is in the middle. And the zodiac signs are very, very interesting because they're not standard. The standard pattern of the zodiac is that it begins with Aries, the ram, spring equinox, and concludes with Pisces, the fish, and then begins again with the next spring equinox and Aries, the ram. So traditionally, it begins with Aries, but this doesn't. In the bottom left-hand corner is Aquarius, and in the bottom right-hand corner is Capricorn. So Aries is not a starting point with this circle, and it's been done in a very, very deliberate way. There's lots of deliberate things about this, which I'll show you. And it's just to get a basic grasp of some simple star law. So it was done in such a way that above the head of Mithras is Cancer the crab, which is the only sign to be governed by the moon, and Leo the lion, which is the only sign to be governed by the sun. So simplistically, there's a center line with the moon and the sun on either side of the brain, if you like left brain, right brain. In a more older way of looking at it, the sun is just knowing, pure knowing, bright shining light. The moon, on the other hand, is reflected sunlight. So it's the reflective mind. It thinks, it ponders, it daydreams, it dreams. You know, it's the reflective thought, the musing. So it's kind of an acknowledgement that the brain or the mind or the self has a wide awake knowingness, but also a very deep reflective thinkingness as well, you know, the duality of the mind expressed in the zodiac. The rest of the planets that were observed in the ancient days are each given to 2 zodiac signs. It's very strange. So only one zodiac sign has the moon, Cancer the crab. Only one zodiac sign has the sun, Leo the lion. Mercury governs both Gemini and Virgo, and that's the next layer down. And Venus governs Taurus and Libra, the next layer down. Mars goes lower still to govern Aries and Scorpio. Jupiter governs Pisces, the fish, and Sagittarius. And then at the very bottom, Saturn governs Aquarius and Capricorn. This is a very rich, kind of a Rosetta Stone of understanding how star law was used in the ancient days. But simplistically, you can kind of look at it as the head being crowned by the sun and the moon, and then planetary chakras coming down the center of the body with Mercury at the throat and Venus at the lungs, and working your way down through Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and so on. So it's like a simple kind of chakra system, if you like, but based on star law. So that basic idea of the sun and the moon, and the kind of implies that Mithras is the lord of the heavens, because the heavens are all around him. And you know, it's said of Jesus that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. That means the beginning and the end, because in the Greek alphabet, that's the first and last letter, Alpha and Omega. The circle around Mithras here, if you look carefully, it's a giant omega. You know, it represents that he is the Lord of the heavens and the center of the all-encompassing everything at the end of all things. You know, that there is there with Mithras. So that's 4th century Britain, albeit Romanized culture. And when we get to the Basilica at Vasily, we're many, many, many centuries on, but Christianity is using the same star law, you know. So at the entrance to the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene, it's this wonderful, ornate tympanum entrance into the main church of the Basilica. I've got a close-up. It's incredibly detailed. Now, arching over it all, it's hard to see. I appreciate that. You have to take my word for it. But there are the 12 signs of the zodiac interspersed with scenes of agricultural activities, sowing seeds, harvesting, ploughing, that kind of thing, different activities of the year. And interspersed are the signs of the zodiac. So if you look at the bottom left, 4 up, you can see the 2 fish for Pisces, you know, and then you can work out the rest. Now, directly above Jesus, there's 3 spirals, and they're quite interesting. That's separate. It's actually 3 mermaids, and it's to do with sacred springs. The 3 mermaids, well maidens. But to the left of the 3 mermaids is Cancer the crab. To the right of the 3 mermaids is Leo the lion. So this is the same star law, zodiacal arrangement as the Mithraic rock birth from Hadrian's Wall. That is, it's Jesus surrounded by the stars, so it's Jesus as Lord of the heavens, but with the sun and the moon above his head, Cancer the crab and Leo the lion. Here's a fascinating thing. There is only one day in the year where you have that center point cusp between Cancer the crab and Leo the lion, that one moment in time when the sun goes from one sign to the other. And that day is the 22nd of July. That's when the sun goes from Cancer the crab into Leo the lion. So that very center point, the 22nd of July, is the feast day of Mary Magdalene. And this is the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene, and it claims to have the relics of Mary Magdalene. Fascinating intrigues. Now, back to Mithras on Hadrian's Wall. On the left, as you're looking at it, his right hand is holding his sword, and he's pointing to the place between Gemini and Cancer the crab. And that is specifically the summer solstice. So with his sword, he's pointing at the moment of summer solstice, roughly the 21st of June. That midpoint between Cancer and Leo, Mary Magdalene's feast day, is the center point. And then in his other hand, he's got a torch illuminating the space between Leo and Virgo. And that's all to do with lighting the way with the torch into the descent into the mystery traditions that always begin around Lunacy between Leo and Virgo, and you descend into the mysteries of the earth and the mystery traditions. So there's a lot here, but drawing your attention back to his sword, pointing to the moment of summer solstice, and also thinking that the goddess of the place of the apple trees corresponds in the Ogham Grove with the summer solstice, that the summer queen. at Vasily, at the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene, and they only discovered this in the 1970s. It had been forgotten. But at summer solstice, to the eve of John the Baptist, which is the feast day of the goddess Anya of south of France, summer queen goddess of the south of Ireland, Anya, was celebrated on the eve of John the Baptist's day. Here at Vasily, for the summer solstice until St. John's Eve, the sun lights up the center aisle of the Basilica. So on the one hand, it's sacred to Mary Magdalene cult, but it also is a summer solstice building, deliberately built to receive the sun's light at the summer solstice. That's really, really interesting. Stepping away now from Vasily, but you can see it in the distance here on the right-hand side. You can see the tower of the Basilica. Down below are some ruins, and these ruins are really, really important and really fascinating. They were only excavated in the 1930s. You know, up until the excavations, it was just lots of uneven ground, and the local people speculated that it was probably the ruins of some old castle. That was what was thought until the 1930s. It turned out, once the archaeology had been done, it turned out to be the remains of an ancient healing sanctuary. Nowadays, it's known as the Fontaine Salée, which just means salt water springs, because there's warm springs there that are salty, hundreds of miles from any coastline. You're inland, central France, you know, that there are these warm bubbling springs with salty water, made it a perfect healing sanctuary spa. We went there in 2013. There was a small museum visitor center next to it explaining what they had found so far. And this is an artistic impression of what it would have looked like in Roman times, that the Romans built a kind of spa healing sanctuary at these ancient springs, but they're far older than the Roman spa. This model inside the museum demonstrates what was there beforehand. So the Celts, the Aedui tribe and their druids knew this place, and the big circular areas in the middle here are the Celtic shrine remains, and you can see here and there the springs, the warm springs inside those concentric circles. On top of them are the kind of rectangle square foundations of the Romans buildings. So the Druids and the Celts already had this circular sanctuary around these sacred springs. Remember, above Jesus at Vasily, the three mermaids, the three well maidens. These are the sacred springs. And then Romans, when they came along, plonked their rectangular square buildings on top. And then round about the 1200s, maybe the 1300s, the monks of Vasily buried it all. And it was something to do with money and the value of salt and how salt was being taxed at that time, and these freshwater springs have salt in them, so they wanted to put a stop to the accessibility to it all, so it all got covered over until the 20th century when it was excavated. So here's one of the springs. This is how it looked in 2013. Bubbles of water still come bubbling up through it. But here's the amazing thing then. Further down, the wells are lined with oak, and the oak has been deliberately burnt to make it harder and waterproof. So it's kind of like burnt oak lining to waterproof the very bottoms of these wells. It wasn't until, I think, around about the 1970s that dendrochronology was done to the burnt oak linings of these saltwater springs. The Bronze Age. Take your time thinking about that, you know. So this is a Bronze Age healing sanctuary that was reused by the Aedui tribe and their druids in the Iron Age, and then was built on top of by the Romans. Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Roman. Generation after generation after generation, that this place was remembered as a healing sanctuary, a place of healing in the Avallonnais. More than that, the river that flows by the healing sanctuary is called the Cure, C-U-R-E, and it means exactly what you think it should mean. So you've got the Cure River and the healing sanctuary that goes back to the very Bronze Age. Too much to go into, but it was just an introduction, if you like. Now there's more intrigues. Vasily, heart center of the Benedictine monks. The Benedictine monks were at Glastonbury as well. It's the Benedictine monks that claimed to find King Arthur's grave and therefore making Glastonbury Avalon. But there's more to it than that. A close-up is there were two big pilgrimages that were very popular in medieval times. The most famous one is the big one that goes to, you know, it's the Camino de Compostela, the way to Compostela on the west coast of Spain. French pilgrims would begin at Vasily and do the big pilgrimage route to Compostela. Compostela, by the way, means field of stars. It's the Milky Way. Compostela, field of stars. So by walking this pilgrimage route, you're following the stars of heaven until the very end of the earth. Finistère means the end of the earth. Ile-de-Saône, off Brittany, where the 9 druidesses lived, was also off another place called Finistère, the end of the earth. The very end of Cornwall is called Land's End. It's the end of the earth. This was a kind of Atlantic coast thing, that the Atlantic coast was the end of the earth. And for England in the 12th century, there was a big pilgrimage from Winchester to St. David's, the furthest west of mainland Britain that you could go, at St. Bride's Bay, St. David's. And the Pope actually said that 3 trips to St. David's was worth 1 trip to the Holy Land. So many pilgrimages went from Winchester to St. David's 3 times to tick off their devotion that they could have gone all the way to the Holy Land. Difficult when there's crusades going on, you know. So there's many other intrigues. Wow. So from Avalon, Somerset, there's a pilgrimage to the furthest west, governed by the Benedictines. From Avalon, Burgundy, there's a pilgrimage to the furthest west, governed by the Benedictines. They all know each other. It's the same period of time. But there's also Crusader intrigues to do with Richard the Lionheart and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and too complicated to go into. I've got a book about it that I'll show you in a minute. but landscape intrigues, zodiacal intrigues. So in the bottom, you know, the old name for Vasily was Scorpion Hill. Before it was Christianized, it had a temple of Bacchus, ancient mystery tradition deity, and it was surrounded by grapevines, Scorpion Hill, before it was the Basilica of Mary Magdalene, temple of Bacchus. So here's the thing then, that there's Vasily has summer solstice, sunrise, or midday sun emphasis. And the lore of Avalon seems to sing of the goddess of the place of the apple trees, or the summer queen. Glastonbury, on the other hand, has a winter solstice sun play. The sun rolls up the hill at winter solstice, rolls up Glastonbury Tor to where there was a pagan temple. And it has the lore of Gwyn ap Neath, which is a winter king. So there's, in a way, two Avalons. One's in Britain, the winter king with the winter solstice. The other's in Burgundy, France, with the summer queen and the summer solstice. Very, very interesting, you know, and there's a lot more to discover, I'm sure. So anyway, if you'd like to know about Richard the Lionheart and his nephew, the Abbot of Glastonbury, who discovered King Arthur's grave at the same time that Richard the Lionheart was off on crusade and gave a sword he claimed was Excalibur to the King of Sicily. True. Fact is stranger than fiction. This is my book that touches on all of this and explains all this and more, available on Amazon. And if you've enjoyed this presentation, then click the like button, subscribe. And if you'd like to donate a little bit of money to encourage more videos like this, then there's a donation button on my website. Thank you very much. I'll do another video like this, probably in a few weeks' time. I've got some busy weeks coming up, but yes, definitely might do something about the Holy Grail, see what happens. Thank you very much. Cheerio for now.